Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, I'll tell you why the offseason grades you're seeing, ESPN, Yahoo, Bleacher Report, CBS Sports, they're all wrong. The Wolves had a much better offseason than they're getting credit for in these offseason grades. We'll break it all down on the show. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. As the playoffs are now over, we're in the dog days of summer. The sports just aren't sportsing like we want them to. But for the rest of this summer, FanDuel's hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Happy Friday, everybody. Hopefully you had a fantastic week. Happy weekend. And today, I want to get into off-season grades. This is off-season grade season, if you will. The dead period between free agency. At least this year we have the Olympics. Of course, we talked a little bit about that yesterday. But now all of the various blogs and sites out there are putting out their off-season grades. And I want to react to the Wolves got the same grade, like 3 out of 4 sites that I looked at. So I want to talk about why they're all a little bit off and why I would argue the Wolves have had a successful offseason to date and deserve a little bit of a better grade. So we'll get into that here today. Big thank you for making this show your first listen every day. Of course, you can listen everywhere. You can also watch on YouTube and the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. So be sure to subscribe and follow wherever you get your podcasts. All right. So the offseason grades thing is always a little bit, I don't know. What's the right word for it? It's usually it's all over the map. It's such a difficult exercise, admittedly. And it's one of those things like content for content's sake at this time of the season. And look, I'm reacting to it, so I'm getting content out of it too. So I'm not complaining about the exercise. It's just such a tough thing. So the first, what started me down this trail, and I guess I do this every offseason, but I started reading what ESPN had to say about the Wolves. And the writer at ESPN who did the article was Kevin Pelton, who's fantastic. I love Kevin Pelton. He's probably my favorite analyst at ESPN because he has the analytical take on, like, that's his background, right? It's advanced analytics. So I was expecting a fair grade. He gave the Timberwolves a B-, and I'll read what he wrote here in a moment. So then I scrolled up and I was like, let me read his methodology, because I looked at the Wolves first, and then I was like, I wonder if I'm missing something here. So I read the methodology, and he says that everything is graded on a curve, with B as the median outcome and designed to reflect the improvements teams made to their rosters via the draft with cap space and free agency. So if B is the median outcome, I have less of a problem with B-. But there's other rankings that didn't necessarily say that they're graded on a curve. And if you're just straight grading teams off seasons, I think grading on a curve in this instance is really difficult because all off seasons are not created equal. There's not an equal starting point here. A team with a ton of cap space or a team with a really challenging, player to re-sign or whatever, they have a lot more to do in the offseason. They have a lot more variance in what they could have done. The Timberwolves, many, including myself, thought they would have a very quiet offseason because they had no cap space. But instead, they manufactured a sixth man, essentially. They manufactured a lottery pick by trading a pick 7 years down the road. And to me, that's getting something significant out of virtually nothing. I'm not saying the 2030 and 2031 picks are nothing, but it's nothing. It has no impact on a team that went to the conference finals this year. There's no damage done to the Wolves' current, like 2 months ago, they couldn't have traded that 31 pick anyway. Like, it was unavailable to them. So they didn't trade anything. They traded, like, I get it. It's still an asset. It's still 7 years down the road. But for a championship caliber team, a championship contender, a conference finals team, a Final Four team last year in the NBA, if you will, a team that was a number 1 seed for the majority of the season last year in the Western Conference, for a team like that to improve itself without having any impact on its current roster, and to take it a step further, any trade assets that were even available to them up until draft night in late June, that's very rare. And I think that context has to be considered. And if you're not, if if you're not graded on a curve, because what that means is everybody above the, like, essentially they're a little less than middle of the pack in terms of their offseason performance. Like there were roughly a little more than half the teams that had a better offseason than Minnesota. Fine. I guess I could buy that. But that's why I feel like at that point we should just do like a 1 through 30 ranking and give them like 17th or something, because yeah, I mean, like OKC did a lot, but OKC had a lot of flexibility. They made a lot of changes because they could make a lot of changes. And this exercise should not also, by the way, penalize the Wolves for swinging big a couple of years ago and getting Rudy Gobert. Like, that's not what this should be. It's not like, oh, well, OKC set themselves up better, because that's not the case. I mean, it is the case in terms of they have a billion draft picks, but both teams were, the Thunder got the number 1 pick last year. The Wolves went to the conference finals. Like, both teams are contenders now. So the point is, grading on a curve is really sticky here. I don't love it. Because it's just more of a ranking than anything else. Because in a vacuum, you'd have to argue that a team like the Wolves getting a lottery pick and not losing, only losing one of the top 8 rotation players. And I'll get on in a minute here to talk about the Joe Ingles-Kyle Anderson thing, which is something we'll talk about a lot later this offseason as well, here in the over the next several weeks, when we really just have the Olympics to talk about. So we'll talk a lot more about some of those kind of in the weeds things. But a B- just feels low to me. So anyway, here's what Kevin Pelton said. He said, limited in draft capital after the Gobert trade, the Timberwolves added Rob Dillingham with the number 8 pick. We won't know if that's the right decision until a few seasons pass. Kyle Anderson was the only free agent who played more than 67 minutes during Minnesota's playoff run. The Timberwolves tax bill made it unrealistic for him to return. Adding Joe Ingles at the veterans minimum to offer some similar skills was a good move, but they'll probably need either Dillingham or number 27 pick Terrence Shannon Jr. to contribute this season. All right, I can't quibble with what Pelton says. Everything he said is right. I think I'll wait a minute to talk about Ingles so we get to one of the other grades here. But I do want to get back to that. And what he said is true. They have 7 of their top 8 rotation guys last year. Ingles is going to, Ingles is 37. So you are counting on somebody who's very close to the end of their career, which is true, to not drop off. Now, he hasn't dropped off yet. So assuming he has a similar year to what he did last year in Orlando or prior to that, then you've got a solid top 8. So that's your playoff rotation already. Hopefully Dillingham's good enough that he's in the playoff rotation, but a lot of teams are shortening playoff rotations to 8 guys anyway. So yes, they obviously need Dillingham and or TJ Shannon to contribute during the regular season, because it's 82 games and everybody's got a rotation greater than 8 guys. But as long as those guys are good enough in the regular season, they don't have to be. Like, TJ Shannon's almost certainly not going to be in the regular playoff rotation next spring, unless there's catastrophic injury to this team that they can overcome, which obviously, hopefully that's not the case. But my point is, it's not like they're replacing the 6th man. Like Naz Reid, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, those guys are back. It's not like they're replacing anyone in the starting lineup. They're not trying to do what Denver did a year ago. They're not trying to do what some of these other contenders have had to do. The band is back together. Like, this is the whole team minus Kyle Anderson. So whatever Dillingham and Shannon give you just has to be more than what Shake Milton, Troy Brown, Monte Morris, Jordan McLaughlin. It just has to be more than what those guys gave you, essentially. Assuming that Ingles gives you, in a different way, with some similar skills, but assuming that Ingles basically gives you what Kyle Anderson gave you. So there isn't like a drastic, hole to fill necessarily. It's the baseline didn't change. If you're watching on YouTube, the baseline's here, and the team shouldn't be any worse. Like, Ingles-for-Kyle Anderson, I said this, I think, on yesterday's show. Similar impact. Kyle Anderson more defensively focused, Joe Ingles more offensively focused, but similar impact, I think, at the end of the day. A net neutral move for a lot cheaper, by the way. And some may disagree with me, but I think Joe Ingles, the offensive spacing he's going to provide, and also still a solid enough team defender, it's about the same. And then you figure the ceiling of what Dillingham can give you is greater than the ceiling of, by far, than what Monte Morris or Jordan McLaughlin could give you. And the floor may be a little bit lower, But he also doesn't have to play backup point guard. Like they have Nickeil Alexander-Walker, they have Anthony Edwards to play with the second unit. Well, actually, I want to talk more about that because another one of these grades mentioned that, and I thought it was a weird way to go about it. So I want to kind of push back on that just a little bit. We'll do all that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at FanDuel. I love sports. I love them so much that I never want them to stop. But now that we're in the dog days of summer, thankfully we have the Olympics upcoming. Obviously, WNBA is ongoing and Major League Baseball. But there's no basketball. We're not quite yet to football. There's no NBA basketball. There's no football. There's no college sports yet. We just get fewer games overall. And late July into August, especially in non-Olympics years, just the sports are not sportsing like you want them to. But FanDuel lets you keep sports going whenever you want. All you have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime that you're in the mood. And to make things even better this summer, FanDuel's hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Do you watch Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day long? If so, no doubt you have to turn down the volume because of all the shouting. Instead, make the switch to Locked On Sports Today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel programmed for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports Today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. All right. So we talked about Kevin Pelton's B- on a curve over at ESPN for offseason grades. Let's talk about a couple others. Let's see. I guess I was talking about backup point guards. Let's do this one next. We'll do Yahoo. And let's see who wrote this. Ben Rohrbach over at Yahoo, who I'm not super familiar with Ben Rohrbach. Not that it matters. I'm gonna tell you what I think either way, and no matter who the writer was. Okay, so he also gives the Timberwolves a B-, and then his write-up says the Timberwolves need dynamism in their backcourt, both behind and alongside Anthony Edwards. They pursued it in Dillingham. It was an aggressive move from a creative front office that also added Shannon, a 23-year-old late first-round pick. Minnesota needs its youth to meet a 56 team where it is at, because ever since the Timberwolves beat the Nuggets, they should have eyes on a championship. Okay, so far I'm with him. I agree with all that. All right. Which is why some marginal downgrades on the roster could come back to bite the Wolves this season. Kyle Anderson is younger and healthier and better than Joe Ingles at this point. As talented as Dillingham may be, replacing the steady hands of McLaughlin and Morris will prove difficult, and the point guard position could become pivotal for a team that plans to put its offense in the hands of a 37-year-old Mike Conley. Okay. I disagree wholeheartedly with that second paragraph. Kyle Anderson being younger and healthier and better than Joe Ingles. He is younger. That's factual. He is, grand scheme of things, likely healthier, although the eye thing certainly set him back last year. Better, we could argue that the salary that they're each getting paid proves that. But without getting like super far down this path, because I've covered it a little bit, and like I teased earlier, we're definitely going to do a full show on this. The Joe Ingles impact on the Timberwolves offense, and we'll dig into some of the lineup data with Kyle Anderson and some of the data for Joe Ingles with other teams. Like I want to look at, and I've done a little bit of this, but I want to dig deep into this and do a show on it. The Kyle Anderson impact on the defense and the Joe Ingles impact on the offense, that is going to be a similar impact. But I think the Wolves have enough talent defensively to paper over what they're losing in Kyle Anderson, because they have Rudy Gobert and they have everybody else on the team is I should say basically everybody else is a plus perimeter defender. At least anybody you're going to put it, guarding the point of attack with frequency is good and better on the ball than Kyle Anderson. Losing his team defense is going to hurt, yes. But Joe Ingles is a fine team defender, and you have other guys to step up. Offensively, there was no hiding when you had Rudy Gobert and Kyle Anderson on the floor that you had two of your 40% of your lineup couldn't shoot from beyond a couple of feet effectively. Now only one guy in your rotation is a non-shooter in Rudy Gobert, and you can handle that a lot easier than two. Like there's a big difference. And the Wolves had a middle of the pack at best offense last year at times. Like it was essentially the league's 20th best offense for long stretches. That needs to improve. If you're going to win a championship, the defense is not going to be worse. It would be hard to repeat exactly what they did last year. And technically, trading out Dillingham for either McLaughlin or Morris and Ingles for Kyle Anderson should make the defense worse. but there's no reason it shouldn't still be the best defense in the league. It just may not be the best defense by as big of a margin. And if you could do that and climb 5 spots in the offensive ranking, that's a better team. The number 1, or call it number 2 defense, and the 11th best offense or 12th best offense instead of the 17th best offense. That's still better. Like, that's still an improvement. Now, I get the point about, like, I get the point he's making, and especially about the point guard thing. Like, he references, but this to me, and this is, I don't want to be unfair here because he's covering every team in an article, and that's tough. Like, if somebody asked me to give a random team an offseason grade, I would probably stumble through it because, like, hey, you need to know the full context and follow a team closely every day. And it's the same reason why talking heads on, NBA on TNT, or Inside the NBA and TNT or whatever, ESPN, they aren't always right about the nuance of some of this stuff because they're not following the team every day. And the comment, as talented as Dillingham may be, replacing the steady hands of McLaughlin and Morris will prove difficult. Sure. And McLaughlin and Morris, steady is a pretty good word to describe them. But remember, this team went stretches last year with neither one of those guys on the floor. McLaughlin was hurt, and then he wasn't trusted. Same thing with Monte Morris. And neither one of them played significant minutes in the playoffs. They both played a little bit. But even in the regular season, like, go back and look at the game logs, the stretches. And remember, McLaughlin hurt himself again early in the season, and then he just wasn't very good. And the Wolves ended up, Chris Finch ended up just playing Nikhil Alexander-Walker as backup point guard, and Kyle Anderson handled the ball, which is something we'll see Joe Ingles do this year too. Anthony Edwards played a lot with the second unit, staggering rotations to allow that to happen. That is the solution. That is the alternative if Rob Dillingham is not effective as a initiator with the second unit. That's the direction they're going to go. They're going to give the keys to one of those 3 guys. They're not going to say, oh man, we don't have Jordan McLaughlin or Monte Morris, a diminished Monte Morris. Like, Monte Morris, I think, is going to be very good for Phoenix this year. But Monte Morris last year was not healthy coming off the injury he had in October with Detroit. Like that, we never saw a fully healthy Monte Morris. And I would have loved to have him back for exactly this reason. But the point I'm making is the backup plan last year is the same that it is this year. It's Alexander Walker, it's Anthony Edwards, and it's the Joe Ingles/Kyle Anderson role. So there's no difference from a team that won 56 games last year in that regard. And the floor, as I said in the first segment, is the same. But the ceiling is much higher with Rob Dillingham. Because if Rob Dillingham does come in and play like he did in the final Summer League game, if he's lights out, if he's, 6th man caliber in terms of a scorer, he's not going to get the opportunity to win 6th man like Nas, for instance. But if he all of a sudden is like, dude can get a shot off from anywhere, he's getting others involved, then the ceiling becomes much higher. And we'll get to that here in a second with another grade that was out there. So, that's my issue with the B-. Well, those 2, the first one I mentioned, on the ESPN one, in a vacuum, what'd they do? Yeah, they added a rookie point guard, and they let one of the rotation guys go and replaced him with an older rotation guy. Fine, B-. But if you consider the range of outcomes for this offseason, they did far more than anyone could have expected. The only thing they could have done more significantly that is in the realm would be trading Karl-Anthony Towns, but that would have made the team worse. And then you could have easily, and I'm sure somebody would have given them a B for that, just because, hey, they got out of salary cap hell and all this stuff. But no, the team, no matter what you do, if you trade Karl-Anthony Towns, this team is worse. And there's a reason I'm not giving oxygen to some of most of the fake trades out there. We talked about one a couple weeks ago because it was, at least, as I said a minute ago, in the realm. It was a reasonable idea, but there's some other ones out there. I'm not even going to talk about it because the Wolves would never do it. If they did it, we could all cry about it together because they'd be significantly worse, but they're not going to do it. So the point is here, the offseason's here. There was not a great variance in either direction on what they were going to do. If they trade Towns, they're a lot worse. If they make this trade, the ceiling for the season becomes much higher, but I don't think the floor is reduced at all because they didn't trade anything to get Dillingham that impacts this year's team. So giving them a B- to me is nuts. I don't think it makes any sense. There's one other place that gave him a B-, so we'll talk about a more positive grade. CBS has a B- for the Wolves, and this was Sam Quinn, who I think mostly does a pretty good job. He gave the Timberwolves a B-, and he says, your Timberwolves grade is largely going to come down to your position on the Dillingham trade. It was unconventional and risky. If this core blows up at any point in the next decade, the Spurs might be getting 2 premium picks out of Minnesota. But the Timberwolves, given their luxury tax issues and the draft picks they already owed out, were simply never going to be able to add a high upside Mike Conley replacement without betting premium picks. They needed a player who wouldn't upend their salary structure, and they needed someone young enough to grow alongside Anthony Edwards as part of the long-term core. Dillingham checks both boxes. The reward is sufficient to justify the risk. He goes on to say, Kyle Anderson is a loss. He was important in the Dallas series. His shooting posed issues in several other matchups. He will be missed, but he was the Wolves' most expendable Timberwolves rotation player. And then he goes on to say, far less expendable Tim Conley. He's not making a long-term commitment because of the ownership situation. And then he says that's worth a slight grade reduction. Given the uncertainty here, it's unclear if there was anything Minnesota could have done to get him signed long-term. So he gives them a B-. The ownership thing's at least defensible, and he shows that he knows what's going on in Minnesota beyond just, looking at a list of adds and subtracts from the offseason, which I feel like some of these other ones did. That's fair to knock them for the ownership situation, even if there's nothing that they can do at the moment while they wait for it to be settled. The analysis of the Dillingham trade is mostly correct as well. Like it's an astute point that obviously we've talked about on the show quite a bit, that this was the only way they could really improve this team because of the luxury tax issues. I don't know that it was as risky as people are saying. Like, again, we're talking, they already didn't have a bunch of picks over the next few years. I just don't understand why attacking when you're onto that. And Anthony Edwards is going to be on the team. Like, the only way this becomes an issue, and I don't want to go down this rabbit hole really, but if like somehow everybody else is gone and Gobert is gone or whatever, and then there's nothing around Ant and he gets antsy here in 6 years, call it 7 years. And then you're which is right at that point in time when you don't have picks and Ant's upset, like, maybe that's an issue. But very likely the core is not going anywhere. They could figure out a way to around the edges make some changes, and the cap is going to continue to increase. All that to say, I just think that it's a weird reason to dock them a little bit. Maybe they were a B and he knocked them to a B- because of the ownership stuff. I guess that's okay. It's at least a reasonable and thought out take. So I can't get too upset about that. All right. Let's see. One more player grade thing to get to, and then I want a quick touch on the ESPN 25 thing. So we'll do that. One more offseason grade. Then I want to touch on the ESPN 25 players last of this century so far. We'll do that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at Game Time. Game Time is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball. It makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to the first pitch. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. You can get last-minute deals by saving up to 60% off buying last minute for sports, comedy, concerts, theater, and more. No matter what sort of entertainment you're looking for, you can find it at Game Time. And again, 60% off, up to 60% off. Also, you can get a panoramic view from your seat on the app before you buy, and they have a lowest price guarantee. If you find a better price somewhere else, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. And as always, the Game Time ticket coverage means that your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. Take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA. That's LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Okay, the last grade I want to get to is a better grade. It's over at Bleacher Report. And it is, I believe it's Andy Bailey. Yeah, it's Andy Bailey. Andy Bailey does a great job. He gives the Wolves an A-. And here's what he says. He says the Timberwolves decided to bring back most of their core from last season. It's much easier to justify with this group. Their best player, Edwards, turns 23 in August. Cat doesn't turn 29 until mid-November. While the loss of Kyle Anderson in free agency cost Minnesota some defense, playmaking, and versatility, Joe Ingles can check a lot of the same boxes on offense while being a much better shooter. Thank you, Andy Bailey. The number 8 overall pick, Rob Dillingham, could provide some scoring punch off the bench. The Timberwolves might be even better than they were last season. I don't just like this grade because I'm covering the Timberwolves. I like this grade because it's correct. he doesn't even get into like this so much. He says less words here than some of the other ones. So he doesn't get into the point I already made about like there's only so much they could have done, and given what they had available to them, they did something impressive. The point he makes about Ingles and Kyle Anderson in one sentence is exactly the point I was making earlier. Joe Ingles does a lot of the same stuff just as well. Certainly on offense. He could pass. He could be a bit of a Swiss Army knife. He could handle and pick and roll. Like he could do all these things. But he's also a better shooter. He's not going to be as good on the ball. But when you have Jaden McDaniels, Anthony Edwards, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, TJ Shannon, I know Kyle Anderson's bigger than all those guys. He's not bigger than Jaden McDaniels, but roughly the same size or bigger than all those guys. But he's also on the wrong side of 30, and I think he was a bit overrated as an on-ball defender. You lose a little bit of versatility defensively, and you lose a little bit of team defense. But Joe Ingles is an okay team defender. So, again, you get a lot of that back. And, again, like he says, he mentions the ceiling just like I did. If Dillingham could provide some scoring punch off the bench, the Timberwolves might be even better than they were last season. There's a chance that they're better simply because of Rob Dillingham and the upside he provides. If he's a disaster as a rookie, they just won't play him as much. They could go get a veteran point guard like they did last year at the deadline if they want to. Or they could do what they did last year when Shake Milton wasn't good and Jordan McLaughlin wasn't good and he was hurt and Monte Morris was, acquired late in the season and was a little banged up. They made it work last season to the tune of 56 wins in a conference finals appearance. And the reason they're not in the finals is not because they didn't have a backup point guard in December. Right? It's also not because they didn't have a backup point guard in the playoffs. They would have helped, but that's not why they didn't get to the finals. They didn't get to the finals because Luka Doncic went off and the Timberwolves failed to figure out how to guard a Luka Doncic pick and roll, which is another topic. But that's what happened. It's not because they didn't have a ninth man. So all that to say, the Timberwolves offseason, to me, I think A- is much more apt. You want to go B+ because of the ownership stuff. If you want to go B+ because they gave up what they gave up to get Rob Dillingham, fine. But B- is a pretty aggressively pessimistic view, and I think an unfair view of what the Wolves and Tim Conley have done this offseason, given the cards that they've been dealt. All right. I didn't leave as much time for this as I wanted, but I want to talk briefly about the ESPN top 25 players of the 21st century, which was posted actually just on Thursday. I may get back into this next week. It's relevant to the Olympics, and I think the timing is probably not I think it was probably intentional here from ESPN to release this, but it's the top 25 players of the 21st century. So going back to obviously the 2000s, they had a panel of ESPN experts that voted on it, and they listed out 25 guys. I'm not going to do the whole list, but I was curious to see where Kevin Garnett ranked, and I was pleasantly surprised to find him number 6 on the list of 25. Which is, I think, the right place. I would maybe go a little bit higher with Kevin Garnett, and I'll read kind of that range here in a second. Because Garnett, I think, was a consensus top 20 NBA player in history when he retired. Certainly top 25. I would say top 20. But then, like, since then, LeBron has obviously surpassed him. You've got, Kevin Durant, you could argue, has surpassed him. And, other and even more guys recently in the overall context of NBA history. If we're just talking 2000s, though, this is prime Kevin Garnett, and like we're not to the end of some of these guys' careers, so that's why Garnett ranks ahead of some of them. So this ranking has LeBron number 1, which is, I think, you can't argue that, inarguable, if you will. Kobe Bryant's number 2. I would not put Kobe number 2. Steph Curry's number 3. Tim Duncan's number 4. Shaq number 5, and Kevin Garnett number 6. By the way, Jokic at 7, Dwayne Wade at 8, Kevin Durant at 9, and Dirk at 10. So I would imagine, and I haven't spent a lot of time digging into the online banter or even the debate shows, talking about this list. It's perfect for this time of year. It really is, to argue this. I actually think Garnett's in the right spot. I understand Shaq ahead of him. I understand Duncan ahead of him, as much as that pains me. As the fan side of me, that pains me. Kobe ahead of Steph and Tim Duncan, to me, is tough. I get him ahead of Steph, I guess. I would probably put Duncan number 2, honestly. I mean, people forget because he was because of where he played and his demeanor and all that stuff. And also his game not being, to the casual fan, not nearly as sexy as Kobe's game. I get it. But Duncan was incredible. So I would probably go LeBron, Duncan. I could argue Kobe or Steph next. I guess I would go Kobe and then Steph at this stage. We'll see how Curry's career finishes up. That's the top 4. And then you go Shaq 5, Garnett 6. I'm fine with that. Jokic 7. Putting him ahead of Wade already is maybe a little tough, but I get it. And then Durant at 9 is probably right. Dirk at 10. And then it goes Giannis, Steve Nash, James Harden. Feels a little high for James Harden. Chris Paul's down at 15. I'd probably put Chris Paul up ahead of James Harden. Anyway, it's a fun thing to argue. It's a kind of to pull this apart. And it's not the same thing as an overall all-time player ranking, because I think overall all-time player ranking, you'd already have to look at, like, you could argue Jokic is, like, I feel like Dirk and Jokic are maybe both a little bit higher. I don't know. That's another conversation, and I'm not prepared to dig too deep into that. Maybe it's a topic for later this offseason, depending on how dry August gets. But an overall historical NBA player ranking, I think, would be a lot of fun. So happy that KG got to 6 here. People forget, not Minnesota people, obviously, but I mean, like, how many players have won an MVP and won a Defensive Player of the Year award, and won a title? Like, not very many players, certainly. So him being at 6 makes a ton of sense to me. And the 04 season is one of the better seasons that anybody's had in NBA history. And then obviously being the key to the Boston Celtics championship, winning Defensive Player of the Year that season as well is crazy. All right. Team USA plays Sunday. I think it's like right around, I think the other day I said it was mid-afternoon. I actually think it's late morning, but look up the time. They play Serbia on Sunday in their first pool game. So we'll talk about that Monday. It'll basically be something of a post-game pod unless other Wolves news breaks over the weekend. We'll cover that on Monday. And then they play again, I think, Wednesday. So we'll have some other stuff for you next week. We're still daily up until the end of next week. By the end of next week, we'll move to 3 shows per week, starting the following week. But still daily for now. So make sure you're following and subscribe to Locked On Wolves. A big thank you for making this your first listen every day. Of course, you can listen anywhere. You can watch on YouTube. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. The Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.